Hello, everyone. My name is Beaumont. I'm the director of the MENA program at Noria Research. I'm very happy to welcome you today for this webinar on the US-UAE relationship. This is a question which we explored in a report we published 2 months ago by our chief editor, Colin Powers, who is here with us today. This webinar, though, won't be a formal presentation and review of that report, rather a discussion around its general ideas and findings. I really want to thank our panel of experts who accepted to engage in that debate. So Matthew Hedges from the University of Durham, who very kindly agreed to chair the discussion, Alaa Al-Siddia from Al-Quds, Ben Freeman of the Center for International Policy, Annelle Sheline from the Queen's Institute, and of course our author, Colin. It's really an honor and a pleasure to have you here, guys. This is our program's first webinar. The publication of the report in April actually also marked the launch of the program. Noria Research, I don't know if you're already familiar with it, but was created around 10 years ago in Paris as a network for young researchers from France and elsewhere to discuss their work on international politics issues. And since then, we've developed into a full-blown research center with regional programs so far on South Asia, Central America, Turkey, and now the Middle East and North Africa. And we provide training in research in the social sciences, in writing, in doing field work, also in talking to the media or to policymakers, which are skills that are often a bit overlooked by academic institutions. Important to say that our program is an independent program, which means, for instance, that we do not receive governmental funds, and we intend as much as possible to keep it that way. We do not pretend to cover Middle East and North African affairs as many already do. We really wanted to give it a strong and clear scientific guiding line, which is what we called the counter-revolution. By counter-revolution, we mean all the political, social, economic, and even cultural and intellectual dynamics which have been taking place in the region over the past 10 years in reaction to the revolutionary moments, and which, to our opinion, are yet to be researched, to be documented, and even actually to be understood as a coherent historical movement. That's what today's event will try to engage in, with a very particular focus, since it will be about political and economic processes taking place mostly outside of the MENA region in the US. Last word about proceedings. So for the whole duration of the discussion, you'll be able to ask written questions. These questions will be anonymous, so do not hesitate to put your name at the bottom if you want to. They will be passed on to the panelists and answered in a second phase after the discussion itself. So we're exploring different ways of having the audience participate in the talk, but today it will work like this with written questions. And finally, the event will be recorded, so it will be available on our website, hopefully in the coming days. That's it. I hope, I have no doubt that you will enjoy it. So once again, I thank you all for being here. And Matt, the floor is all yours.
I'm looking forward to this talk. Maybe just to give these presentations to put into context, soon after the 9/11 attacks in the US, the UAE was denied access to purchase access to the US ports. And that's a real indication of how far Emirati influence has come in the US. This was the watershed moment at which Abu Dhabi decided that it really needed to change its image and branding across the world. And I think since then, there's been a coherent focus and attempt to really enhance how it's perceived, and hopefully this discussion today will be able to draw out how far this image and state branding has become. So after that short and interrupted introduction, I'd like to hand it over to you to give us an opening background into your paper.
Sure. Thanks very much, and thanks for everyone who's attending at home or in their office. So I'll try to keep this brief and not bore you for too long. So the primary kind of research puzzle that that I set out to explain, as touched on by Matthew, was to make sense of the UAE's kind of recent ascension as an American partner, because as Matthew indicated, they were refused the purchase. DP World had attempted to acquire a number of American ports, and they were at that time really subjected to a lot of racist and other kind of critiques, including from Chuck Schumer, who again was referencing the specter of terrorism were the UAE to control these ports, but in the years since, they've really kind of elevated their standing inside Washington, and this is coextensive with the arrival of the current ambassador, Yusuf Al-Otaiba. But so that's kind of at the core of what I was trying to examine and explain. But beyond that, I was also kind of curious as to why, unlike Saudi Arabia, for the most part, the UAE's managed to dodge political or popular censure in the US, and this is despite its complicity in absolute catastrophe in Yemen, its involvement throughout the region in Sudan, and with all kinds of sort of nefarious players. Dubai's standing as like a major money laundering hub. There's any number of things which you would have expected, especially a new democratic administration, which is heralding the return of a law-based international order of kind of the adults are back in the room, morality will again govern American policy, and yet the Democrats have shown themselves, for the most part, fairly sanguine on the UAE and are not trying to rock the boat. And so when you add to that the fact that the embassy in particular, but other players were very involved with the Trump administration, both indulging their kind of excesses and ignorance, but whether it was the Iran nuclear deal or other kind of interventions inside Washington, they were quite engaged. And so why would the Democrats now seem to have no response? And why would they be willing to kind of accept the status quo ante? I think, the traditional answers would probably first focus on imperial conceits, you get some kind of credence from statements Joe Biden's made over decades. Particularly there's one recurring motif in his speech making that he said, if Israel didn't exist, we need to create it, to have something to kind of look after American national interests in the Middle East. And so that shows you okay, there is sort of a grander design, there is sort of a purposefulness with American foreign policy, and they like to have client states or partners that can look after interests. In the case of the UAE, that would be energy supply, it would be maritime networks, and it would be funneling capital back to the metropole. As I'll discuss, they've done that in abundance. But at the same time, I think those, if you're just going to focus on empire and things of that nature, I find those answers very underspecified. How does this materially operate? How does this relationship, nothing is as simple as client and kind of master any of these things. It's always more complicated in reality. So it remains understudied and I think a bit underspecified. The second kind of more recent answer would be to say, well, Abraham Accords, right? They made peace with Israel. Israel is, a long time kind of privileged actor within the US, and then that should give them, all the capital they need with Washington to sort of behave as they want elsewhere. That also clearly has some merits, but I don't think it's sufficient as an answer because, again, the UAE's standing kind of preceded this sort of announcement of the publicizing of the relationship with Israel. And so what I tried to do was to kind of focus on the more precise mechanisms at a slightly lower level of abstraction, be they structural, institutional, ideational, or kind of micro-sociological, that inform the US-UAE relationship and that particularly inform the Democratic Party's current outlook on this relationship. And so herein, I sort of divided my efforts and honed in on two domains. The first was economic. And so I looked at the financial sector and the kind of entanglements that are now connecting the United States and the UAE. And those are rather profound, and whether you're talking about private actors in the UAE or the main kind of state sovereign wealth funds, the dealings, particularly between Abu Dhabi and American commercial banks, investment banks, asset managers, which would include private equity guys like the Carlyle Group, but also giants like BlackRock. These involvements, whether as investors or partners in investments overseas, are quite substantial. And then there's also, outside of the financial sector, we have Abu Dhabi's investments in American tech. So that's kind of the Silicon Valley axis, real estate, and they are one of the largest kind of property investors in the US, foreign property investors in the US. And of course, the defense contractors. And that's more of a consumer role, but the business that the UAE, doesn't quite measure up to Saudis, but the business that they furnish for the Northrop Grummans of the world is enormous and is a massive part of their overseas business. And I don't think that can be discounted. And so in kind of trying to make sense of these economic relationships, I saw two kind of variables that were relevant to then the American political outlook. The first was that the density and kind of scope of the money involved, creates a structural imperative, right? That there's a lot of money at stake and nobody wants to lose a lot of money. And so there's a basic kind of incentives that are structural to the system that let's not take an antagonistic line. There's too many dollars to be lost and too many players that would be losing money. The second is that if you try to identify the actual businesses, sectors, and actors that have benefited from the growing kind of economic closeness of the United States and the UAE, a lot of the actors on the American side are amongst the most politically influential in our domestic politics, so I don't think you don't need to veer into conspiracy to understand the influence that finance in the US has on our policy space and on our policy class. The same can be said of tech and real estate, and of course the defense contractors. You can ride a metro in DC and see the billboards for arms dealers. This is constitutive of kind of the scene. And so in doing business and in investing and in having partnerships with all these actors, that creates another sort of variable that is incentivizing a close political relationship between the two countries. Beyond that, I thought, and this is something Ben can talk to brilliantly and far better than I can, but I was interested sort of more, what are the direct interventions into the American policy space? And, how has the UAE tried to shape the way policy is conducted, but also how has it tried to shape how it is constructed as a kind of epistemological entity within Washington? So how is it, affecting the way it is presented in media for kind of popular consumption, but also how is it trying to kind of massage or even without anything sinister, how is it trying to get its message to those on the Hill, the Pentagon, and elsewhere to kind of influence the way policy is actually made? And I think this part of the research is, again, Ben does wonderful work on this, and there's a kind of growing movement of scholars and investigators inside Washington that are now increasingly paying attention to the think tank industry, public communications firms, lobbying, of course, and sort of how, to my mind, the UAE, and as many other foreign states do in the US, they kind of operate a vertically integrated system where they can sort of leverage relationships with think tanks to produce or not produce reports on certain topics. The public communications firms can kind of pass those reports and messages on through media or directly to the Hill, to the staffers of people working for elected officials. And then the lobbyists are kind of the final, more blunt instrument for making sure that the point is delivered to those who have power and agency to kind of enact policy. And then, like, you know, sort of as an auxiliary measure, you have the more elite hobnobbing, which the UAE ambassador is famous for, and kind of how cultivating relationships with sort of the power elite, to borrow a term of C. Wright Mills, which I'm sure is out of favor these days, but it is, you know, garden diplomacy has always been a thing in Washington and elsewhere, and he is obviously very, very gifted at it. And I think in this general kind of vein of research, there's on the one hand, there's the actual kind of discursive outputs. So how do you actually shape the way people think about these issues, or which issues they think about at all? But also in kind of building these relationships with particular think tanks or public communications firms. I think what's less understood is that many of the parties involved at these institutions, you know, these are very high social capital people within Republican circles, but also within Democratic circles. These are people that are liable to return to an administration for work at some point in their career. These are people that spent a lot of time in Washington, have many friends that are currently working for the Hill, on the Hill, or in administration, or at the Pentagon. And so if you think about the relationships that are kind of realized and consolidated through funding and through other things, this gives another sort of variable that would be pushing at a kind of more micro social level a cast of individuals that are, you know, of influence within the American policy community to take a more you know, commiserating and sympathetic outlook on the US-UAE relationship. And I think that's something, look, these issues are sort of diffuse. It's hard to attribute particular causal effects to discourse in general, or to these kind of these relationships. It's hard to know exactly where, you know, things become materially important. But I think I would be reluctant to diminish the effects that having a network of very high leverage individuals within Washington, I would be reluctant to diminish the effect that can have on kind of the enactment of policy. So I think, you know, for me, I'll leave it there for now, but I'll kind of just see, like, I would love to hear from Annelle on how she's viewed the Biden administration's, you know, policies, both vis-a-vis the UAE, but also vis-a-vis the issues that the UAE is very influential upon right now, which includes Yemen, of course, maybe first and foremost, and sort of how she both understands the UAE's current presence, or lack there physically of, but well, actually not physically, they're occupying a few islands, but you know, kind of how that transition has happened more recently, and how the Biden administration understands it. And then, you know, Ben's kind of knowledge on the entire intellectual infrastructure in Washington, I think is so important to understand for grasping how private parties or foreign partners, whoever it might be, try to influence what are ultimately public decision making. And then I think for Matthew and Alaa, I mean, the domestic consequences and the domestic, you know, long-term effects of sort of this US-UAE relationship. What does this mean for people within the UAE, and what does it mean for the region around them? I think you guys can speak to that better than anyone, and that would be, you know, that's what I see kind of very fruitful topics to pursue.
Okay, Colin, thank you very much for an opening address and a good in-depth exploration of some of the issues and topics and key takeaways that you highlighted within your research. I think expanding and trying to maintain some form of a narrative, Ben, it would be good if we can go to you to briefly overlook some of your expertise within that intellectual field and maybe draw out some of those comments and observations from Colin. And then we will go to Annelle and then Alaa to have the foreign policy suggestions and what impact this could have. And then again, as Colin said, Alaa would be a great, is a person who can then highlight how this contrasts, what impact does this have, on some of those key issues of, say, human rights or ideological issues, which could have impacted the US-UAE relationship. So, Ben.
Thank you, Matt. And also thank you to Noria Research for hosting this panel and having me on. And I'm honored to be here. Most of all, thank you, Colin, for just a wonderful report and putting all this together. It truly is a wonderful report, too. For viewers who haven't read it yet, it's Dollars and Decadence, and you can find it on Noria's website. I particularly enjoyed the report because I thought, Colin, what you did there was you really captured this multifaceted, sophisticated UAE influence operation in the US in a way that very few people do. And I think the perception that many people have is that influence in America, it happens the old-fashioned way, where a lobbyist is roaming the halls of Congress and talking to their old buddies. Which that does happen, and the UAE does have a very sophisticated formal lobbying and PR operation. They're one of the top 10 spenders under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Year in and year out, they spend more than $10 million every year. In fact, they've spent over $100 million in just the last 5 years. So on average, it's more than 20 million over the last few years. But there are many other components to that I think it's critical that we think about when we're looking at UAE influence. It's the think tanks that you mentioned. We did a report on foreign funding of think tanks, and the UAE is actually the third highest donor to think tanks in America. They've given over $15 million in the last few years. It's the highest amount of any non-democracy giving to the US as well. And beyond that, they're one of the top donors also to American universities. And this is an area of influence. I think really we're just seeing kind of the fledgling stages of research about what does this mean? What influence do countries get by giving to higher ed in the US? For the UAE has American college campuses on their soil. NYU, for example, I've talked to some scholars that work at NYU and have worked in the UAE campus, and they report sort of rampant academic censorship, even targeted harassment at professors who sort of don't toe the line, even censorship of the textbooks there. And yet the UAE money keeps flowing into NYU, and NYU has done little to nothing about these issues that are identified in the UAE. Beyond that, I think Colin did an excellent job of tapping into the business interests that are also a part of this influence complex there. If businesses are making millions, or in some cases billions in the UAE, then they're going to tend to side with the UAE. We see this explicitly with the lobbying firms that work for the UAE. Many of the lobbying and PR firms that are working for the UAE are also working for the same defense contractors who are selling arms to the UAE. So when one of these lobbyists walks into an office to lobby for an arms sale to the UAE, they're checking a box for two different customers at the exact same time. And we see the same thing with think tanks too. Many of the top think tanks in DC that are taking money from the UAE, they're also taking money from the big defense contractors that are profiting from these arms sales to the UAE. Well, one of my favorite examples on this is that in many cases, the arms deals to the UAE don't actually start with lobbyists. They sometimes start with think tanks. A few years ago, the UAE gave $250,000 to the Center for a New American Security to write a report on the US exporting drones to some additional countries. CNAS did the report, and not surprisingly, the report came out and said it might be a good idea for the US to start exporting drones to countries like the UAE. You guessed it. Fast forward a few years, and the Trump administration did this, agreed to it, and now the US can export these drones to the UAE. So what might seem like small contributions, $250,000 here, $250,000 there, we know that there's no such thing as a free lunch when it comes to these donations. We know they can have very real policy implications, and they can have very serious implications for foreign policy issues in the region. And with that, I will turn over to two people who are much smarter than me when it comes to U.S. foreign policy in the region, Alaa and Annelle. Please, I don't exactly know who's next, but I look forward to your comments.
Sure. Thanks very much, Ben. I think it would be great now to get some more impact and thought about how the Biden administration, maybe in comparison to the previous one, to President Trump's administration outlook towards the UAE, how that's now being felt and what could it look like going forward?
I assume that was directed at me. So yeah, first of all, just wanted to say this is truly a very impressive report, so highly recommend that everyone read it. And much of it lies far outside my realm of expertise, really getting into the weeds of all the financial connections, obviously, as Colin mentioned, especially in the tech and real estate sectors. So truly fascinating, very well researched. To get to this question about, and essentially the essential puzzle that Colin raises, which is, why do we continue to see such a close US-UAE relationship, regardless of the extent to which they behave in ways that are counter to US interests or US objectives in the region? And I just wanted to point out two things that actually reinforce Colin's argument, but I wanted to sort of critique this broader epistemological space within which we're all operating. So Colin points to the fact that, one explanation for this strong relationship would be the need to guarantee the free flow of oil, which is just a common sort of explanation for why the US continues to remain deeply engaged in the Middle East, despite the fact that the US itself is no longer dependent on Middle East oil, in fact, is one of the largest exporters of fossil fuels in the world. And so I understand why Colin pointed to that, because it's something everyone gestures to, and his point was, well, but that's not enough to explain it. And my point would be, we don't actually need to continue to give credence to that assumption, simply because a lot of these countries are fully dependent on oil. And so the United States does not, in fact, need to guarantee the free flow of oil. None of these countries want the oil to stop. That would be the end of their economies. So just one little quibble there on wanting to sort of tear apart that ongoing assumption. Bob Vitalis at UPenn has been really instrumental in emphasizing the need to shift that assumption. Another was the use of the word alliance or ally, and sort of this notion that the UAE is an ally, when in fact it is not. The US does not have any allies in the Middle East. Not even Israel is in fact a true ally in the formal definition of the word. And so obviously, despite the fact that there is no formal arrangement between the US and UAE, it does get much more to this notion of shared values, which Matt had mentioned at the beginning, and much of the branding that the UAE has very much invested in. And I really do agree with 9/11 as a critical juncture, as a time when not only the UAE, but governments, Muslim majority governments around the world. We saw statements from Pakistan, for example, coming out, and Pervez Musharraf a few years after 9/11 emphasizing the need for enlightened moderation. And we've seen this is a large area of my research, is this strategic use of so-called moderate Islam as a means of signaling compliance with the US security agenda. But a lot of these governments use it to go after Islamist opposition groups in their own countries, to point at them and say, well, those are terrorists. And then the US isn't going to question any sorts of human rights abuses of those often individuals who would otherwise be seen as perhaps allies of the United States for trying to advocate for more representative government and even democracy. And so the UAE is a true exemplar of this approach of being so strategic in its public relations campaign. And we've seen this build up over time. A few highlights were things like when Pope Francis visited the UAE in early 2019, was the first time a Catholic Pope had visited the Arabian Peninsula. In general, just this image the UAE constructs, and not only, obviously, as Colin's report shows, it's not a hollow image. The UAE is in fact a very much a hub for the power elite, as Colin mentioned. It is they've worked very hard to make sure that their economy does attract a lot of investment and serves as a global hub for finance. But that comes at the same time, that is part and parcel of this image of the UAE as being this place of tolerance, of perhaps indulgence. You can go there, perhaps somewhere where things can happen that would not be allowed to happen, especially not elsewhere in the Middle East. So I do think that while Colin's report really highlights the actual nuts and bolts of what's happening here and why we continue to see the US turning a blind eye when the UAE acts in ways that are counter to American interests because of the close intermeshing of the American and Emirati economies, and especially at this sort of power elite level, that would this really affect the pocketbooks of the average ordinary American? Perhaps, but what it would really affect would be the balance sheets of some of these super powerful, wealthy individuals. So this just circles back to this notion of the Biden administration as opposed to the Trump administration. And in general, I think the point to emphasize here is a point that Colin has made in his report, which is much of this goes back to the Clinton years, when you started to see this clear, more of an emphasis. Obviously this had started earlier, but really this was when the Democrats in particular jumped onto the neoliberal bandwagon. Sort of the Reagan revolution continued from an American policy perspective, and both parties were fully online with slashing public spending and really investing in kind of neoliberal policies and globalization. And it was under that context that we saw the UAE, DC sirens, we saw the UAE making these moves. And obviously then with 9/11, the urgency of that became much more evident, that there was this concern by a lot of these governments that if they did not very clearly signal their compliance with the US agenda in the Middle East, that perhaps they could be next on the list of autocracies that the Bush administration might try to topple in their futile effort to try to impose democracy on the Middle East. So just in conclusion, just the point I think is Colin's paper makes so clearly that this is not about Trump, although much of sort of the backroom deals are going to continue to come clear, I think, as some of these lawsuits come through and more information comes out about just the extent of the corruption that was happening in the Trump administration. So it did reach a new high watermark. But I think the important thing to keep in mind here is that this did not start with Trump. It certainly did not end with Trump. And so this is why it's very important, the work especially that Ben does and others do in continuing to draw attention to the ways in which special interests tend to win out over the actual interests of the American people or ordinary people in general.
Thank you very much, Annelle. That was a great overlook and overview, sorry. Alaa, it would be good if you could now maybe explain or maybe analyze how governance has changed within the UAE in relation to its strengthening relationship with the US. Have they become emboldened by their increasing influence abroad? Are the two connected? And if so, have there been changes over the last 5, 10, 15 years within this dynamic?
Okay, thank you for having me. Thank you, Noria Research Center, and thank you, my colleagues, for the very important inputs regarding the situation in the UAE. I think I'm a living proof of what's going on regarding the human rights violations in general, and especially in the academic field, where there is no longer more red lines, because there is no longer spaces between these red lines anymore. Regarding the report key findings, I want to share my concerns about the ability to reform systems in our region generally, and the GCC and the UAE, in light of the relationship between the US and the UAE. The UAE is taking the lead in the Arab world in supporting the counter-revolution and hosting the old guards, but at the same time, it's the leading economic partner of the US in the MENA region and the US export market for almost 12 years. Here, an important question begs to ask, will the US compromise human rights, democratic values, and civilian safety versus economic deals after moving on with the arms deals by the Biden administration? I think the answer was clear. This deal cost amounting to $23 billion, and it's crucial to have such deals to strengthen your economy for sure. Still, with the second party impunity, the argument of preserving the peace is not valid. And these deals will fire back for sure. That's if you are asking about the impact and how it will amplify in our region. And this will for sure affect the humanitarian situations where the UAE intervenes, like what's happening, for example, now in Yemen, despite the allegations of forces withdrawing. The UAE political system, unfortunately, lacks an efficient tool of holding the corruptionists accountable, which makes impunity of these weapons consequences an easy thing to do. Most of the current changes in the UAE laws are minor, artificial, and targeting the media and the UN institutions, and in a PR campaign to show the UAE as a progressive country seeking to reach the moon and invade space, or going to the Mars. In this approach, the UAE authority uses its soft power by supporting research institutions, as you mentioned before, in the US to promote its view of tolerance. So, for example, I think Hidayah Center is a partner to many US-based institutions, yet this support is conditional. If we want to prove that, we can ask the UAE-based research centers or the centers that are supported by the UAE in the US to publish this research or any other research that slightly criticize the UAE stakeholders and see if they are willing to accept it. In the UAE, you are allowed to enjoy personal and entertainment freedoms partially, which is impressive for sure, but you are not allowed to criticize the authorities and not allowed to say that you are not allowed. If you did, you would be legally condemned by anti-terrorism law and anti-cybercrime law for the accusation of insulting the authority. I don't know, but this might recall some violations in the US history in the past, where entertainment activities were allowed to some groups, but without their participation in political affairs. In the UAE, or the UAE authority claimed that the woman is equal to the man in the UAE, but she still cannot pass her Emirati citizenship to her children, for example. And the UAE also tried to promote that its authority defeats terrorism by throwing peaceful dissidents into jails for long sentences and not, unfortunately, investigating their alleged claims of being tortured and calling this under the law. I will end my intervention with a tragic story that explains and shed a light of how the ultimate dream of working in the UAE become a nightmare. The main character of this real story is Amr, He's a 29-year-old Sudanese who paid to travel to the UAE expecting to work as a security guard in the air-conditioned skyscrapers of Abu Dhabi. But from the day he arrived in September 2019, he had grown increasingly uneasy about Black Shield Security Services, the Emirati security services company that hired him. His passport and phone were taken away. He was required to undergo months-long military training, and he was kept in the dark about where he and hundreds of other Sudanese recruits would eventually be posted. Despite his nagging doubts, Amir never imagined the company would drop him and about 270 other Sudanese workers into a military base in Libya, a country in a conflict where governance remain divided between two opposing entities, the internationally recognized and Tripoli-based government of the National Accord, GNA, and the rival interim government based in the eastern Libya that is affiliated with the UAE-backed armed group known as the Libyan Arab Armed Force, LAAF. The story has not ended. I urge you to read it and count its human rights and migrants' rights violations, and how Amir could hold the UAE authorities and security company accountable. And globally, how could the international stakeholders prevent the permission of civilians from carrying weapons? All these acts and violations require a principled stand and real accountability to all associated actors in the political scene between the UAE and the US, because this relationship really allows what's going on in the ground with UAE's neighbors that intervene in their own affairs and reaching to this deteriorated humanitarian situation.
Thank you very much for that interesting and obviously quite telling observation about the trajectory of the UAE. I'd like to ask the audience if they would like to ask questions to please put it into the chat box. I will, and this is the same for the presenters here, but I'd like to first ask, due to the strategic nature of the investments that the UAE makes within the US and the results with which it seeks, are these investments and partnerships at a state-to-state level, or are you seeing specific certain actors and organizations conducting this? There are certain individuals, obviously, like Sheikh Tahnoon or Sheikh Mansour, which you would see at the forefront of this, but are there predominant networks that you see emerging that are the predominant conduits of that nature?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think a future report or research that I would like to conduct is to kind of map the actual networks, which I know, Matthew, you've done a huge job in kind of trying to understand the domestic networks that sort of empowered Mohammed bin Zayed's rise and consolidation of power. And so I would be curious to understand the private networks, especially, you know, within Abu Dhabi, because of oil production and sort of the state's control of so much of that wealth. I was able to focus really on the sovereign wealth funds, and though there are private individuals of great influence, even though I just limited my focus to the sovereign wealth funds itself, the monies involved were so profound that kind of gave an indication of the depth of the relationship that's been developed with the United States. But I think as you open the scope a little bit, or the aperture, and you take in Dubai, especially, where you have sort of the old merchant capital, which is much more influential and somewhat independent of political power, I think that would be very fascinating to kind of to trace within Abu Dhabi, I do think it's imperative to kind of convey, Mubadala, or the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority. This is not the sovereign wealth fund of Norway, which is run by, which has a centuries long outlook, and is kind of run by bureaucrats and technocrats for the purpose of kind of growing the long-term wealth of the country. Now, while those goals are absolutely part of why Abu Dhabi set up these institutions in the first place, you look at the board of directors of these places, and they are filled with, again, the same cast of characters, which is mostly the siblings of Mohammed bin Zayed and his kind of most trusted coalition members. You know what I mean? So there's inevitably an intersection of kind of political strategic interests and profit seeking. And in the final instance, functionally, I'm not sure it makes any difference, right? So whether they are purely pursuing growth and profit making, the nature of our current global economy is that in pursuing profit in the United States, you're going to put your money into finance and tech, and all of these sectors, which just so happen to also be incredibly politically influential. So even if we were to allow for a moment that there's not actually a strategic rationality in forming kind of the business of sovereign wealth funds and of public money, I'm not sure it would ultimately matter to the kind of big picture political relationship that has been cultivated with the United States. But going forward, to go back to your original question, I think narrowing in on the particular private actors that are, and the firms that are sort of empowered, emboldened, subsidized in different ways, encouraged to kind of build these relationships, both with the United States, but then also, throughout the Middle East and throughout Europe. And I know if you guys are aware of Adam Hani at SOAS, he does fantastic work kind of looking at these economic networks and kind of Gulf capital and how it has expanded.
I believe he's actually moved down to the University of Exeter.
Okay, I didn't know that, but yeah, he's sort of given me a great many kernels to think about, and sort of I think going forward, especially as we try to make sense of the region's outlook in the years ahead. It is, if we're trying to understand counter-revolution and all these different dynamics, it is not only loan guarantees and direct budget supports and dealings with Hamedti or Al-Fatah Sisi or whoever it might be at the state level. It's also the telecommunications investments in all these countries. It's the oil infrastructure in Libya. As Alaa was speaking, the Sudanese men were dispatched as involuntary mercenaries, not for no reason. They were protecting oil fields that Abu Dhabi has essentially acquired in Libya. And so there's this intersection of economic and political strategic, and in the case of Abu Dhabi, there's, because of the nature of power and its concentration to a particular family in the final instance, it doesn't take a massive mapping exercise to know who are the players involved in this, and so I think it's going to be really important to unwind the economic, political, social consequences of all of this kind of building of economic relations and others.
If I can jump in there, I do think just to get back to sort of the reason that DC and the US has become so vulnerable to this sort of money inflow does get back to the point that that Colin makes in his report that I alluded to earlier, which is the lack of investment by the United States in our own institutions, in American universities, in American think tanks. And so I do think it's interesting, the extent to which the Biden administration, although there's a lot of frustration with that they're moving more slowly than many on the political left would like, but we have seen, for example, this recent bill that passed the Senate investing in, we'll see what it comes down to, but at the moment it's $100 billion over 5 years in American research and development. And this is couched in countering China, which is a whole other problem. I think in general, the United States clearly needs to invest in our own institutions of research and universities, et cetera, regardless of what China is doing or the threat that China supposedly poses. But in general, so I do think this is perhaps encouraging, that perhaps we're finally seeing the pendulum swinging back in the other direction. And as more and more attention is drawn, especially through the work that Ben is doing with my colleague Eli Clifton on drawing attention to the lack of transparency in a lot of DC think tanks, which Colin's report very much gets into the effects of that. Recognition of the fact that there must be more investment in American institutions by the US government or by entities that don't have their own external agenda. One additional point, I think, just to, we'd mentioned Yemen, so I just really quickly want to frame Yemen in the context of the UAE's broader regional ambitions. Colin had mentioned the UAE's continuing presence on the islands of Socotra and Mayoun, but also they continue to hold key strategic infrastructure, airports, et cetera, and continue to fund the Southern Transitional Council and other separatist groups. And essentially that from their perspective, the UAE, to my understanding, is hoping that perhaps the future South Yemen will be something of a client state, or even if it is only an autonomous region within a Yemen that manages to hang together, that the UAE would have significant influence there and ability to influence the Bab el-Mandab Straits. And so all of this, however, is very dependent on the US continuing to remain the military hegemon in the region. The UAE is very concerned about the thought that the US really, 3 administrations running now, has tried to do this so-called pivot to Asia. The US military footprint remains enormous. It has really almost not changed at all. We saw that Biden might even send US military personnel back into Somalia after Trump had gotten them out. And this is cemented by, for example, the recent ongoing agreement over a sale of F-35s to the UAE, which would really emphasize this strong security relationship and further just cement the US military establishment and this sort of relationship with the UAE. So, and they want that because the UAE knows that in a future Middle East that actually sort of reflected a real balance of power with an Iran that would be integrated into the region and would no longer be treated as a pariah, that would diminish their influence simply given the size and strength of Iran's population and economy. So just to think more broadly that this is about the UAE trying to look out for its own interests, and that I think in general the United States hopefully will kind of see through the very shiny PR campaign that the UAE has very successfully produced, and to really think about what is actually in the interests of Americans and in the interest of broader regional security and stability in the long run, which does need to actually reflect the inherent power balance in the region.
Okay, I wanted to respond before we take a question to Alaa, which was your perception of the UAE's manipulation of funding within specific research and education areas sounds an awful lot like the Chinese debt trap itself, as a way of extrapolating additional influence by funding these organizations which are underfunded deliberately. So it's quite a curious contrast there. Alaa, there's been a question from the audience, which actually follows on from Annelle again, which is, how much can we attribute this aggressive geopolitical stance to the Arab Spring in 2011? Is the domestic threat still that viable? And considering the Yemen war did not lead to any fallout within Abu Dhabi's supremacy within the Union? It would be interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I've said that the UAE actually is leading the counter-revolution act in the region with the coalition with Egypt and other countries, and also welcoming the the old guard and hosting them in its own land. And now recently, it's also supporting the influential, we call them here in our region, fashionista, and influential people on the Instagram, and they are now attracting them with a very huge contract to promote its own narrative of being tolerant and being a progressive country in the region. But regarding that question, I don't know how it could be how it could be violence to ask for your own needs or claims you demands, a very peaceful demands, and how you can stand against your own people will of reforming the political system and reforming the educational system, health system, all these important system and sectors in your country. How it could be violence to only peacefully protest against corruptionists in your country. I'm not sure if I understand the question very well, but I hope that I answer part of it by saying that, because I'm not sure if the UAE is standing with people will and want to preserve the peace by using the weapons and using its own arms and intervening in other countries that way. For example, I mentioned earlier the story of Sudanese guy, and he's not exceptional. There is a lot of similar stories of what's going on in Yemen and UAE and other countries, Syria, for example, Libya. And the humanitarian situation is worse than before, than when people go on the street and demand for their own freedoms and rights.
Okay, thank you very much, Alaa. There's, I suppose, what the observation is, well, there were domestic reactions to the Emirati participation within Yemen. There were outcomes and outputs, especially in some of the northern Emirates. There was significant tribal unhappiness, and that there were quite deep political outcomes which were felt. But we've had another question here, which asks, can you think of any precedent of any relationship between states which doesn't amount to a true alliance in the strictest sense of the word, as Annelle pointed out very interestingly, but which would be built on a shared strategic interest on what could be called a shared geopolitical value? Is there a comparison here to be drawn with Israel and the US, for instance, or does the comparison only work to certain limits?
Happy to jump in quickly, but if anyone else wants to take it on. I absolutely think that that's quite fair. And although it is important to keep in mind what are actual allies of the United States, given the mutual defense pact that entails, I absolutely agree that the system of alliances hasn't in fact been updated. And so I think geopolitics has continued to shift without the US formally declaring new alliances. And yet we see alliance-like behavior. And so quibbling about the actual alliance perhaps misses the point, which I think is perhaps what the questioner was saying. And I absolutely see parallels to the Israel relationship. And I do think that the Abraham Accords were sort of the cherry on top in terms of the UAE being able to signal to the United States that they are the ultimate moderate Arabs, that they're even willing to normalize. They were the first to normalize with Israel. And then interestingly, we did see obviously Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco all jumping on board. They all received something in return. What's been interesting subsequently is to see additional Muslim majority countries, for example, Bangladesh, apparently considering normalizing, even without the sort of incentives that the Trump administration was so willing to provide, really any, Western Sahara, just throwing around incentives to these countries, regardless of the geopolitical or humanitarian implications for the people on the ground. And so I absolutely think that there is very much a parallel to be made there and between the UAE and Israel. And to go back to my point about both, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, these countries really want the United States to remain deeply engaged and bogged down in the region. And they do fear the implications of what it might mean, again, if Iran was allowed to engage as sort of a normal country. Obviously, those are big geopolitical considerations. I think it's also very important to keep in mind how this actually plays out for people on the ground, that Iran is also no great bastion of human rights. And so I do think as those of us who are working on these questions are thinking about how to try to continue to draw attention to this, I very much commend the work of my colleagues, Alaa and others, who are really emphasizing what this means for individual people.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in on that point. First, on the question of kind of partners without being allies and things of this nature, I think something that can be confusing to as you try to make sense of these relationships and their nature and their consequences is the role of kind of path dependence. Because as Annelle said a long time ago, the oil question is not really relevant to the U.S. anymore. It doesn't need Aramco to make our economy run anymore. But over decades, and the same can be said with the relationship with Israel and now with the UAE, over decades, you do kind of build continuities with the policy class, with the think tankers who are taken on junkets to Abu Dhabi, and they get, this is the first time to the Middle East. These guys don't speak any Arabic. They don't know anything about the Middle East, but oh my God, there's a Sparrow here or whatever. This is just like the West. And that's kind of good enough to sort of set in motion these self-reinforcing mechanisms, which can lead you to the point where today you look around and you think, well, geez, the UAE is actually acting in opposition to the United States in all these different theaters. For me, the biggest consequence is the consequence that Alaa discusses and other people. It's what does this do to people on the ground? But even were you to be someone who's just like, I'm an American, I'm really into the American national interest, it would not therefore imply that we'll go have a partnership with the UAE, because what they're doing is clearly not serving the American national interest. And so I think these kind of strange path dependencies, they need to be accounted for when one is trying to reform policy or even understand it, because often these arrangements don't really make rational sense. The second point I wanted to bring up, and because like the Israel analog is an important one, but the Israel-UAE relationship now and this kind of broader reactionary axis that has been consolidated in recent times, unofficially for a long time through intelligence sharing that connected the Gulf monarchies with Israel, but now, increasingly in the open. This is another kind of major area to watch going forward. And principally what I'm interested in, and I know what a lot of Palestinian scholars and others are, is that Israel has developed essentially a security tech industry on the basis of, what are de facto experiments on Gaza and on the West Bank, right? So whether it's surveillance tech or it's hacking technologies for cellular phones and everything else, there's now a kind of rather vast industry that is very connected to the Israeli military itself, which is exporting technologies principally first through the Gulf. Last week, Haaretz reported on a Saudi deal with an Israeli firm that allows the technology is now provided to Saudi domestic intelligence to hack one's phone without you even needing to click on a link. So it's just, remote, immediate access to someone's phone. And so this is, again, where the profit seeking and strategy intersects, right? Because there's a huge amount of business to be done by these Israeli firms. They are quite keen to do it, and they are doing it across the world. But I think as our economies in the post-COVID era struggle, and they've struggled for a long time all over the place to provide enough employment for enough of especially younger populations, so as to secure social stability, what certain governments look for are therefore tactics and techniques for maintaining discipline on those who are excluded from the economy. How do we, in the US, it was how do you control the ghetto historically, right? This was the focus, the urban problem. And for many of the Middle East countries, it's the huge informal sectors. It's, what all the kind of agrarian migration to cities because they've gutted farming and turned it over to huge corporations. In this particular moment in history, what is very worrisome is that there are technologies that are developing and relationships between states that are conducive to building kind of regimes of control and discipline that will be, rather harrowing for democracy and for human rights, and that are putting populations, across the world, but especially in the Middle East, at risk. And that's where, I would watch this kind of thread line connecting what is being developed in Israel via its in the West Bank and Gaza, with the kind of the Gulf in particular, but it'll spread into Egypt, it'll spread everywhere. So I would just encourage everyone at home to just keep an eye on that.
Two very quick comments, and to immediately piggyback off what Colin just said. A little known fact that I think very few people actually know is that Israel is per capita the largest arms dealer in the world. The US is the largest arms dealer in the world, but per capita, Israel's number one. They send out billions of dollars in weapons to other countries in the world every single year. To the question here, I really like this question, and thank you to Annelle and Colin for buying me time to actually think about it. But my take on it is very much to steal a phrase from the kids these days. Defining the relationship is hard. And I really think we do a disservice to ourselves when we try to put it in these boxes of, ally, friend but not ally, competitor, cooperator. Anytime you put it in those sort of narrow frames, I think we do a disservice, because what we're really talking about here is a very large scale of, when you think about comparing the interests of the U.S. with the interests of another country. And I think when you look at it as a scale, I think it becomes a lot easier to understand what's fraught about the US-UAE relationship. The US is a democracy. The UAE is not. Not only are they not a democracy, then they actively try to put down democratic movements in other countries. So not a line there. The US values human rights. The UAE ruling class clearly doesn't, against their own citizens. And of course, against the migrant laborers there. So on many metrics, when you start to go down the scale of US and UAE interests, it just really doesn't align. And so I think that's why so many of us question the reputation laundering that the UAE is doing here in the US and in Europe, and basically pulling the wool over our eyes about all of these things that don't match up, and getting us to only focus on the things that do, specifically the business interest and the money that's to be made in the UAE.
I'm actually going to come in and maybe disagree slightly. The UAE has expertly, absolutely aligned a certain ideology and message to appeal to foreign audiences. Within the economic and commercial sector, that it does this extremely well. However, in the domain of security, for example, they have continued to defend their image and self-awareness of delivering security and countering terrorism. This is a predominant angle by which they do support themselves, at least abroad. You know, to put it maybe into context, as Alaa spoke about earlier, there is the Hidayah Countering Violent Extremism Center. There are multiple counterterrorism operations and missions which they have with other multinational, with other states. And I think this is a prominent platform from which they do continue to foster a degree of international legitimacy. Are there, and I think maybe as a last question, unless anybody else has anything wholly outstanding, what are those other ideologies or those other messages by which the UAE does try to align itself to internationally? What can be accepted to a wider audience? Because as we've all said, and you know, what they do and they conduct at home within an area, within a realm with which they can control, is very different to that which they present to the wider world and community. It'll be interesting to see what contradictions you know of.
Yeah, I think, Matthew, to your point, I think they have been quite deft, and it does depend on sort of the discerningness of the audience, many of their cells, to my, like, you know, so essentially they've presented a security stability binary, right? Whereby if you allow popular governance, if you allow, you know, representation in the Middle East, ergo it leads to instability, primarily because it facilitates the rise of Islamists who are not quite defined as what they mean by that, but it's Islam. They're like playing on kind of old Orientalist lineages here to say, well, you know, that's bad, right? And so I think they have managed to convince at least parts of political classes throughout the West, for sure, on the merits of the impossibility of stability absent kind of an authoritarian footprint. And I think it's a very, what they have actually provided where they are operating is a very fragile and precarious stability, if it can be called that at all. It's one built on, you know, massive repression, and it does not seem like it actually has an immense amount of staying power, just because it, as a social formation, it is too exclusionary and it's too, you know, it's too repressive. But in the very immediate sense, so long as they do have the technologies and the money and the diplomatic support and everything else, well, it can hold a lot longer than any of us would like, you know. And so I think the ongoing struggle for everybody, especially for us in the West that can try to advocate on behalf of people in the region, is that, you know, this is hardly the only option that exists, and it cannot be the best option, obviously, right? And so the goal needs to be, how do we allow people to realize their best lives and to enjoy freedoms and prosperity and kind of a basic sovereignty and autonomy, whether as a nation or as individuals. And it does not get achieved by kind of accepting these very, you know, very superficial and rather absurd arguments, but that have certainly gained traction through the, you know, the enormous resources they put into it, and through, you know, especially as you pointed out, the anti-terrorism nexus. Maybe that's fading a little bit from popular consciousness, but it's been immensely potent for 20 years now in kind of shaping how publics and others think about international affairs, domestic affairs. I mean, we're still dealing with the Patriot Act here, so it's, you know, it is very potent.
I mean, I would only say to sorry, Matt, just to push back on the pushback just a little bit. I completely agree that there is this sort of this counterterrorism reputation that the UAE has earned and exported to its benefit abroad, and I do think that is certainly warranted. But I think where we should be a little suspect of little Sparta, as UAE has been called, is what it does with that military might. We've seen in Yemen how destabilizing that can be. We've seen them work with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula there, and US weapons have fallen into AQAP's hands there because of UAE involvement. We've seen some of the UAE security forces, as I mentioned, in other countries, helping to suppress democratic movements in those countries. So I think even on that score, it's sort of a mixed bag. Does it benefit U.S. interests to prop up the UAE military? On the counterterrorism scale, I'd say yes, but I think there's some very big concerns there still. Though mostly I do agree with you, Matt, to be perfectly clear.
Just one final point to kind of jump back to Colin's about the stability, democracy, the notion that is a trade-off, which as Colin said, unfortunately, a lot of members of the US foreign policy establishment have bought into. I think especially after 2011, when there was a lot of optimism that maybe this would change. And I think there was an abrogation of responsibility there, that Americans in general and the foreign policy establishment in particular don't acknowledge or register the fact that the American military presence in the region is a huge part of what is propping up these regimes. And so although of course the United States historically was funding civil rights or civil society organizations, and this notion that the US is trying to promote democracy, that was always so minuscule in comparison to the effects of this massive US military presence, which again was based on this notion that the US just wants to maintain stability in the region. But again, I'm just echoing and trying to reinforce what Colin said. This is not true stability. And though unfortunately what we did see coming out of 2011 was this retrenchment and a lot of authoritarian learning from how to use surveillance and to prevent the ways that new technologies were sort of allowing for popular resistance. But I think we're just likely to continue to see this cycle, and the fact that these are not in fact stable systems, and that the sooner that the United States realizes that, the better it will be for the region, and for American interests, that again, when the entire 20 years of the war on terror were the results of the fact that the United States continues to prop up these regimes that violate the rights of their own people, that abuse their own people, and that the United States still doesn't quite seem to understand that we are perpetuating the system of deep instability and deep injustice. So mostly just echoing Colin's excellent points.
And I can add just one last thought of what I think as what UAE try to promote as its own ideology. I think internationally it's want to show the world that it's the police of the region by its abundant financial resource, and internally it want to show the other countries and its own people that there is a welfare life without a freedom and democracy, and it could be happen. Because of the brutal approach of silencing the dissidents, for sure, but eventually the history teaches us that it won't last, and people and the situation will reverse us sometimes. So we don't want to wait for it. We want to solve it before it's happening.
Thank you very much, everyone. Robin, are you there? He is.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you. 1,000 thanks to all of you, Matthew, Alaa, Ben, Annelle, and of course Colin, for this fascinating conversation. Really, I think one further issue will be how countries like the UAE also not only reach out to states like the USA, but also to political parties, for example, in France, actually, to try and spread this public relation campaigns, especially in the far-right populist segments of the political spectrum. We'll have to work on that as well. Thank you all for attending. The discussion will be online very shortly. In the meantime, I encourage you all to go and read Colin's report and to get acquainted, if it's not the case already, with the great work of each participant here and of the organizations they work with. New reports already underway. Colin is kind of a writing machine. We'll keep you posted, keep tuned. We'll have the opportunity to meet again very soon. In the meantime, take care of yourselves. Thank you again for your interest and your trust, and see you very, very soon. Goodbye to all.